So give it a minute. I think we're good. I think it says recording. I can never tell with Zoom. It's not very clear. So fingers crossed. So hi, everybody. Welcome back to Views with Verse. This is my interview series where we talk not each week. We try to do each week, but it doesn't end up being like that, about different elements of spirituality, about views from across the universe, which is the general premise. And today I have the wonderful Miss Benebell Wen with me.
Hi, how are you, Joe? Is it Joe
Yeah.
or Joey? Which one do you
Joey.
prefer? Joey. Okay, I always see the J-O, so I get confused with internet. So.
Yeah, I have to change it on Facebook, but Facebook
Okay.
is thrilling when you try to change your name for whatever reason. Is this really you? Yes, it's just EY on the end. Why is it different? And so apologies to everyone who was just expecting this last week. I wasn't very well last week, so Benebell graciously agreed to reschedule to this week. So here we are. We're here this week. We managed it. We're all good. Fingers crossed.
Yes.
And we're going to be talking about cultural heritage in spiritual practice, tradition versus evolutionary practice today. Nice and simple.
Nice big topic, nothing, keeping it light and fluffy,
Nice and simplistic for everyone. Yeah,
Absolutely.
we're being basic today. Although I think it ties in really well with what's actually going on in the world in general right now, because we've just sort of come over the kind of the controversy of Logan Paul in the YouTube community. And he was actually disrespecting Japanese culture and Japanese spiritual heritage. And I know Benebell visited Japan not long ago because we were all like, look at the pictures, look at all the pictures. I really want to visit Japan so badly. And I was just thinking how it's interesting that you get these waves coming through, even in general cultures and general society, of it's kind of becoming a bit of a battle for cultural, and you get like buzzwords like cultural appropriation show up. And I know that Benebell's just done a video about race in spirituality. That was a one that you've just done. So that's a long-winded way of saying that's what we're talking about today. Breathe. So firstly, how was Japan?
It was good. Well, just sort of dovetailing on what you just said about how it seems like cultural norms mirror or reflect what occultists or mystics and spiritualists have been talking. I think it's interesting because people who are more sensitive are going to tap into sort of a universal archetypal energy or an undercurrent that's going on. So we're like kind of murmuring about that. And then you see the symptoms arise on the sort of public or the mainstream stage. And so I think you're absolutely right that it's interesting how they mirror each other, but I think it's also sort of expected, because we're tapping into some sort of a collective energy that's been going on, and then we see the symptoms of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Logan Paul in Japan, as he said.
It's because he's made the headlines, so everybody is talking about it. Like everyone and their mother is talking about it. Everybody knows who he is now, which is kind of sad in a way. Great, but that to me is really interesting because we're basically living in a time which has become even more conflicted, I think, about cultural differences. And you've got creepings of racism coming in, and I've been seeing more examples of it here, there, and everywhere. And talking about cultural appropriation and things is becoming more and more prevalent, more dominant, especially within spiritual realms. And it's always one of these topics which gives me a little bit of a headache, really.
Yeah.
And I'm like, because where I sort of stand is you can respect cultural heritage, but it doesn't have to be the be all and end all of a spiritual path, a spiritual working, a spiritual gnosis. So how do you feel about it, Benebell? Because obviously, for anyone who doesn't know, and I shouldn't imagine there's going to be anyone, but Benebell presents all sorts of spiritual matters, but she brings in like the Chinese cultural and traditional practices, and she has got some fascinating videos about the deity, which is perhaps slightly unusual sadly in the YouTube community. And so that's a really unique perspective a lot of the time, and that's really interesting. I think that's really, it provides an insight which is sorely lacking, because you get a lot of people who have embraced like the Egyptian pantheons or the Celtic pantheons now and the Nordic pantheons, but you don't get so much of a representation of the Chinese pantheons. And other pantheons, such as the Japanese pantheon. You don't hear so much about that either. So where do you sit with regards to tradition versus personal gnosis, I guess?
Well, as to the East Asian pantheons, the Japanese, I think, well, what's interesting is I feel like it's not, when I'm in my cultural like context, I don't think it's obscure. Do you know what I mean? Like it's sort of just prevalent, it's mundane, it's boring, it's everyday life. And
Mm-hmm.
then when I sort of jump into sort of the actual like westernized world I live in, because I do live in the States, I realize you're right, it is virtually non-existent. And so I've always wondered about that dichotomy. For the Chinese culture, I can tell you a lot of it has to do with the Cultural Revolution, unfortunately. So the last dynasty, the Qing dynasty, and then you had, the communist takeover, you had modern China.
Mm-hmm.
That whole sort of political movement really did suppress a lot of Taoist magic and Taoist occultism. It was seen as sort of the shameful aspect of Chinese culture.
Mm-hmm.
And so the Chinese people themselves would suppress it. They burned books. There was massive book burnings of anything that related to Taoist magic. Anything that was remotely a Taoist grimoire was burned because it was seen as a shameful part of the culture. So I think that's why. And then you also have this issue of when Westerners sort of graft pieces of Chinese culture and take it back to the West, they just sort of take the philosophy and they leave behind the religion,
Mm-hmm.
because the philosophy to them is interesting, but the religion can sometimes be dissonant or conflict with the Western religions, right? So
Mm-hmm.
like, oh, we'll just leave that behind. That's just superstition. Let's take over Taoist philosophy, but leave the sort of superstitious aspects. So that's sort of problematic as well. But as in terms of tradition versus evolutionary practices, I think we need both. We need people who are conservators of tradition as it was practiced historically and within the context, or the so-called purebred version, and we also need an evolutionary progressive movement. So I think both are really necessary in society.
Because I find the history of between the West and the East really interesting. So for anyone who doesn't know, now I've done more research about the Japanese, admittedly, because I have had a big love affair with Japanese culture since I was 4. But I have researched around some of the Chinese history with particular emphasis on when the ports opened and all the problems that brought to China in particular. But it's really interesting. It was the Dutch had ports in particular. They did better than the other Westerners. They managed to strike up an accord. But unfortunately, like it almost was a clashing of cultures, and there was kind of an absorption of a lot of Western things, and there was kind of like a backlash against that in from a historical perspective. And there was some really interesting points of history surrounding that when that occurred, and unfortunately you have the big thing that is known to have come from that is opium wars, and the problems that kind of literally brought in this awful thing that had then happened, and this kind of culture of opium that happened, and that took away from the people in general. Like this horrible trade started to pop up when the two cultures came into contact with one another, and I think that's probably the start of a problem, because you see cultures coming into contact with one another, and then there's this really negative fallout from it in one of the first instances. And I wonder if this kind of problematic nature of two cultures, not, well, to be honest, it's the Western culture coming over and not respecting the Eastern culture in that circumstance in history, but whether there's a level of respect which is not held, and there's a level of understanding which is not held, and we're seeing mirrors of that in today's society, where people are falling back into kind of like racist dogma, and it's like, this is not spirituality, guys. This is not helpful. This has been done in history. This has literally been done in the pages of history. We need a different kind of approach to this right now, which is why it's really great that Benebell talks about the spiritual side of things, because at least people get a perspective and a level of understanding. So
I think it's tough, like you can't ignore history, and
No.
everything you said, it's true. You know, you can't, you have to understand why people today, you know, the legacies of China would be pissed and kind of more resistant, more exclusionary, and kind of put up walls, because the last time, well, they didn't even say welcome. I mean, you know, the ports were sort of forced open. I think the Chinese
Yes.
have always been very like, so the Chinese are very sort of ethnocentric as well historically. They call themselves the Middle Kingdom. They believe they're the middle point of heaven. And so it's not even like, you know, the planets revolve around the earth. You know, it was like, oh, all of the other nations revolve around China. So they have this sort of, well, we don't need you kind of
Hmm.
attitude, which actually hurt them ultimately. So you see how, you know, no matter who you are or which side you are, exclusionist mentalities ultimately hurt you no matter what.
Yeah.
And because of their exclusionist mentality, their ports were forced open. And then, you know, all the, like you said, the Opium Wars and everything, the Boxer Rebellion. And
Mm.
so I think because of that, spirituality has this dissonance where you do have a lot of, for example, Chinese mystery traditions that exclude white people. And then you have the ones that, you know, welcome white people. They're more commercialized and they're kind of like just taking people's money. But that's sort of a tension within, you know, my tradition as well, which is fascinating and political.
Mm.
So,
And I think, unfortunately, there's kind of like an adoption of a lot of the kind of like the representation in the West of Eastern spirituality and culture in general is kind of this weird bastardization of what they think it should be or is. And it's like I grew up and there were always like Zen gardens everywhere, and like
okay.
commercially available Zen gardens. And then the Chinese and Japanese tattoos were very popular. I mean, when I grew up, they were everywhere, that you could get like necklaces with the Chinese symbols on, and you would look at them thinking, are they even accurate? Because I bet they're not. And you hear horror stories about people getting these tattoos and they don't mean what they think they mean, because they haven't actually embraced the culture, they haven't learned the language, even they haven't, you know, investigated into it. And I think that is a symptomatic of a lacking of respect, which is a problematic thing when we're talking about cultural heritage, but in spirituality as well as in general terms of how people interact with different cultures. Because I think we have this very limited idea of what Chinese is, even to the point of food, that like, what English and Americans think of Chinese food, Chinese people do not think of really as being Chinese food for the most part.
Yeah,
So,
that's true.
and I know it happens in Japan as well, because like I said, I've done more research into the Japanese side of things, although the Japanese adopted a lot from China, from what I understand, and being quite close and trading and things. Also, point of history, I know that the Chinese actually went visiting, like first they had ships way before the West did, and they went, and with the cartography and everything, and they went and mapped the world, but they just didn't interact with other people.
Yeah, they're like, oh, we're better than you. We don't care about you,
Yeah.
which is
So
bad, bad.
I loved this idea that the Chinese were like, yeah, we've known about you for a very long time. We've got all these maps. We went and we didn't care for you, so we, we came back again.
Yeah.
But it's interesting how different like the history of the world might have been if that had not been the case. If they had actually been the ones making first contact, it's an interesting thought, that sort of one of these things of history that just didn't happen. But what if it had happened? Would that have changed the culture of the rest of the world?
Yeah, well, if it's hard to say, right? Because the reason it didn't happen is because so deeply and fundamentally, it's not part of the sort of cultural ethos and cultural consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's almost in a kind of in a sort of fatalistic sense, it could never have happened based on this systemic culture, right? This idea of we're the best, we don't want to live there. Like, why would we live there? Why we don't want, you have nothing to offer, like that kind of a sentiment. And
Mm-hmm.
so to sort of play out the hypothetical, you have to get rid of that root, you know,
Mm-hmm.
consciousness where, oh, we're ethnocentric. So if you get rid of that, yeah, that would be really interesting. But then would the Chinese culture still be the Chinese culture? And would they be able to transmit that culture to the rest of the world? You know what I mean? It's kind of
Yeah.
interesting. Like, it's an interesting hypothetical question.
Mm. Yeah, it's again, it's a hypothetical for anyone who's watching this afterwards. The way things are just the way things are. So, and the way history is played out is the way history is played out. So it is interesting though, because I find the whole idea of them traveling and knowing about the rest of the world really fascinating. What in the Americans are like, yes, we have traveled, we have conquered, we are the first travelers. I'm like, guys, no, you're not. But sure.
Yeah. But
So
speaking of Japanese culture, it is interesting, like the parallels between, like for example, Shinto.
mhm,
If you write Shinto in kanji, or how it is in Chinese, it's Shen Dao, which basically means the first word for Shinto, Shin is spirit, and
mhm,
the To is Dao, Taoism's Tao. So the same word for Taoism is that To, is just a different pronunciation based on the language you're speaking. So Shinto is, in that sort of etymological and historical sense, a path of Taoism. Like it's a form of Taoism. It's just a very different path from some of the paths of Taoism in the, on the mainland. So I've always found that to be interesting. And then of course you have the Buddhism.
mhm,
I would even argue that a lot of the Buddhism in Japan has sort of preserved the heritage from, dynasties ago, whereas in China it's evolved. So when we're talking about tradition versus evolution, in
mhm.
China, I think Buddhism has really evolved and progressed into something very different today from what it was practiced, for example, in the Han Dynasty, whereas Japan, interestingly enough, has retained a lot of that sort of cultural tradition, and they've conserved the way Buddhism, esoteric Buddhism, was practiced thousands of years ago. So interesting, huh?
It is interesting, and I think there may be even a cutoff point within history when this happens, but I know that the Japanese kind of have this parallel thing that happened where on the one hand they want to preserve, and then on the other hand they embrace everything new and interesting and foreign to a certain extent when borders began to open up and people began to see these different cultures. And I know, for example, in Japan, like going into the 1920s in particular, there's like a boom of fascination, and you can see photographs with people with umbrellas for the first time, 20s or 30s, and they were really fascinated. But at the same time, there was a large group of people who wanted to preserve everything. So that's interesting how that kind of then creates kind of like a dynamic, like a duality within Japanese culture of you. And you can even see it within their infrastructure, within the physical buildings of the land, that they have these incredibly ancient, beautiful temples and ritual spaces. And then on the other hand, they have all the skyscrapers and the modern technology. And I wonder whether it's the difference with China is because at the point where you're talking about integration of communism and kind of like the overwriting instead of like the separation. And I wonder if that has something to do with it, that rather than there being a tradition and an evolution, which is something you've mentioned already as being necessary, they kind of went for one rather than both.
I think so just to sort of demonstrate the compartmentalization that happens in Japan, when James and I, my husband and I were there was something that we observed that I thought was so fascinating. We were outside a Shinto temple about to go in. So they have that torii at the gate. And
Mm-hmm.
there's like certain, like before you go in, you're supposed to walk from the side, you bow, and then you walk in. And then you're supposed to be really quiet, anyway. So before you enter, it's like the busy sort of modern streets. And we saw like 4 or 5 teenagers. They're like, modern, like, very fashionably dressed, being loud, not obnoxious, but being teenagers, right?
Mm-hmm.
Talking to each other. And they're, pretty loud. They get to the torii, and they're 4 Japanese teenagers. As soon as they get there, like they all hush, like sort of unspokenly, tacitly, they bow, they walk in, and then they're quiet and respectful, and they're in a religious mode. And then sort of seeing that like instant transformation, we're like, oh, that's why their culture is successful. You know what I mean? They can compartmentalize. Right now, we're in the modern world. We can sort of be this type of persona.
Mm-hmm.
But when we enter into a spiritual realm, you have to respect the gods, you respect the ancestors, and they absolutely preserve that sort of the integrity of that tradition. And
Mm-hmm.
then when they walk out, they're back to ha 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 ha, oh my God, right? It's just really interesting. I think with Chinese culture, communism is a very different, it stripped away religion. It wasn't saying this is modern society, this is your spirituality. It said you don't need spirituality, all you need is the government. And
Mm-hmm.
so the society fundamentally became atheistic. and anything, it wasn't even just a Taoist thing, or like, it was all religion, Christianity, Buddhism, it didn't matter. You didn't need religion. That was bad. That was a form of, suppression. And so that's, I think, why we weren't able to sort of have that, balance of modernization and tradition the way I think the Japanese culture, and to some extent the Taiwanese culture, were able to have.
Mm. Has there been any kind of revival, like a resurgence within Chinese interest in things of the spiritual past, or is it kind of very limited? Like, is there more of a movement when people are interested in the Chinese heritage of their Taoist roots, or is it more individuals that sort of go back and research and bring that into the modern era?
So in Hong Kong and Taiwan, I think it's always been pretty strong and intact, So if you go to, for example, the southern regions of Taiwan, Taoism and Taoist magic is still practiced quite prevalently. Then you see the Chinese diasporas in Southeast Asia, like Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand, but the Chinese diasporas in those areas, they preserve a lot of that sort of Taoist magic, because a lot of the times it was the people who practiced these religions who escaped out of China during the Cultural Revolution. Then they sort of formed their own little cultural bubble wherever they went, right? And so that's why you see the tradition preserved outside of China. Within China, so one of the things I actually criticized was a lot of the sort of people interested in metaphysics in mainland China that I talked to, they're more interested in my perspectives in tarot and Western mystery traditions, and in the same breath, they see Taoist magic and Chinese forms of mystery traditions as backwards and superstitious. And so I always found that interesting, that you can kind of see the mysticism in your own culture as backwards, but then be like, oh, can we talk about Western mystery traditions? Can we talk about Western grimoires? Can we talk about tarot? And I'm just like, I'm not saying they're the same, but do you see what I'm saying? Like, the spirit behind both are the same. So how can you reject one and embrace the other? You either reject both or you embrace the other, like sort of, logically speaking. But I think there's a little bit of a revival.
I wonder how much of that is the mysticism in something being other, because I think that there is a fascination in the West with a lot of the Eastern techniques.
Yeah.
And again, there's some weird sort of parallels, the things that people draw in, and it's kind of, I'm not sure where this has come about, but it's kind of an amalgamation of ideas, and people, there is an unfortunate tendency to kind of cherry pick the things that stick with us. So for example, like the chakra system is very much like cherry picked from the eastern side of the world, and it's not, maybe not quite how it originated or how it was studied or how it was presented. And I know there's a lot of holistic medicine that from China that makes its way across, and they talk about the meridians and the energy lines within the body. And I'm sure that what we're getting in the West is not even a fair representation of how it might be practiced or used to be practiced within China and other places in the other side of the world. And I wonder,
chakra, Reiki, yoga, take your pick.
Yeah. And I wonder that, because personally I love the idea of an evolutionary spiritual personal practice. I think the problem is when you are taking an evolutionary practice, but you're not holding a deep enough respect for where things have come from, or to investigate into where things have come from, or to have an understanding of the history and the culture of things. So I guess, how do you feel about people learning and interacting and practicing with Chinese deity? Because presumably you bring that to the fore so people can be informed and investigate further. And how does that look when you're bringing that to the world?
It's so tough. So here's the thing. I think fundamentally and authentic, I love it. I always get really excited when anybody's interested in things that relate to my culture. And I think sort of that cultural sharing is so important. And it's sort of, in the long run, part of how we can strike harmony. And I think it's really important to have that and to welcome, a diversity of opinions in every single heritage, in every single tradition, and have sort of preservators, and then also the evolutionaries, these sort of evolving the culture and having that synthesis. But at the same time, I don't ignore, like you were saying, some of the consequences of that is that not everybody deep dives into everything that they learn. And so what ends up happening is you have like the pop culture version of everything that then sort of, and it's okay to have the pop version if everyone sort of has the universal understanding that this is the pop or fast food version of it, but you don't have that, you know. And I think sometimes, you know, just very recently I was watching somebody on YouTube, a non-Asian, talk about, you know, Asian magical traditions, and really sort of, you know, very, very ostentatiously kind of, I was thinking, you know, I don't know how I feel, you know what I mean? Like when I answer your question, because I do want to have that welcoming of diversity, and I really want to see lots of different people, you know, venerate, you know, Taoist pantheons the way I do. But then when I watch it get sort of, you know, like twisted around, then I don't feel comfortable. And then I don't know how to make sense of that feeling. Do you know what I mean? So I don't know how to answer your question.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about whether or not it's even possible, if you haven't had a submergence in the culture, that you can fully honor and respect the way that things are presented, the way things mean something, the kind of depth of emotional response that people who have been submerged in that culture. I think that might be an interesting middle ground, because I'm not somebody who's like, you have to be Chinese to work with Chinese deity. I'm not somebody who's like, you have to be Celtic to work with Celtic deities, because the crossing over and the merging within history is a thing. You know, the people, even when people were reluctant to intermingle with other people, there are examples of it throughout history. There isn't this kind of insular history that people present, and this is very, very true in the West. It's true in the East as well, to an extent, and you can see how, you know, the Japanese took on a lot of Chinese culture and things like that. So it's not that culture is ever stagnant and insular, but on the other hand, I think you do need to have submerged yourself into the culture to fully appreciate it and fully kind of venerate it, I guess, to see these things as being holy in a way, like feel the way that those practices feel even within the land, or within the people that have been grown up there, who have submerged there, who have moved there, have lived there for some time. Because I think you get interconnected to the energies of a place, of a culture, of a way of being, by living that. And I think that's can be difficult for people when they're presenting, like, I've discovered this and I've been learning about it, but I haven't fully submerged myself in the practices as much as possible. And I think that does deepen spirituality from a cultural sense. So I wonder how much of that is. Do you feel that with having lived in America? Do you feel like that you have integrated with elements of the culture more from living there?
I think you can't help it, you know. You know, if you live in real life and you're not insular, you can't help but sort of integrate. And so I see, and I think spirituality evolves kind of on an interestingly like same pace as what's going on in your everyday mundane life. And so I think if I had just sort of stayed in Taiwan and I never left the southern region, the rural regions of Taiwan, I think my practice would be really, really different from what it looks like today. And so and I think that's actually part of spirituality, sort of not in terms of religion, but just part of how people who are in tune to the unseen realms around you, you do connect to the unseen energies in the land that you're standing on. And so, for example, if you go to Hawaii right now, or if you just visited Japan, like in the moment while you're there, that moment, your spirituality is very different from how it is wherever you are, right? You see what I'm saying? Because you're connecting to very, very different energies in Japan versus the energies you're connecting to on the lands that you're living in at the moment. And so I think that's the evolving part. And also when you're talking about tradition versus evolution, it's not just race, it's also gender, you know? You see this in Western mystery traditions. Like recently, you know, the book, some book I was reading, old grimoire, a medieval grimoire, I think it was the Book of Abramelin. It was saying how married women, can't really be practicing the rituals that they were talking about in the book. They're like, yeah, this is not really for married women. I was like, oh, that's interesting. And then like in the East, you have a deeply patriarchal society when you're talking about Taoist. It's like very, very patriarchal. I have some interesting stories on that too. And so do you want to evolve from that? So if you stay with the patriarchy, then you're retaining and conserving tradition, right? And so if someone who looks like me practices it, I'm just sort of fundamentally, just by existing and doing that, changing the, dynamics of the tradition. So how do you reconcile that,
Yeah, this is part of, I think for me, this is part where evolutionary practice becomes necessary. And there's been some really interesting books about feminism in China and feminism in Japan, because I've read a few around that subject. And it's really, truly interesting in the differences between that kind of revolutionary thought within the West versus that kind of revolutionary thought within the East, and how that it is very, very different. It's a little bit more, I'm going to say it's more aggressive in the West. I think there was a more of an aggressive reaction at some point in the history of feminism in the West, and you have much more of a very overt form of resistance. So people know about the suffragettes, people know that they chained themselves to the buildings. This is documented. Whereas I think in the East, it's been more of a gradual and intellectual, or quite often, resistance. And I know that when I was reading a lot of the material, there was kind of a intellectual presentation of why this is not something that we want to keep going, because this is backwards and we want to progress. And this is going to help us progress if we stop doing this, if we stop saying that women can't be on an equal footing. So that's interesting. And whether or not that, in terms of how the spiritualities practice has altered things, because particularly within Celtic tradition, which is the one that I'm most submerged in, women were on equal footing for the most part. I mean, you have history to back you. You have stories of great Celtic queens fighting back against the Romans. So it's interesting, because from my perspective, that's not a part of my spirituality which I've ever had to worry about, because the Celts were on pretty much, women were in battle, women were leading battles. That was their way of life. So that's not an issue that I've ever really faced in terms of looking at the way things were versus the way things are. But it's really interesting. So how have you kind of like...
Well, what's interesting is if you really do look at history, in Taoist magic, for example, one of the most well-known, not even priest or priestess using gender, but one of the most well-known sort of leaders of a mystery tradition, and it was one of the most famous mystery traditions in terms of Taoist magic to come out of China, was Wei Huacun, who's a priestess. She's female. And and she was sort of leading a whole bunch of dudes, a whole bunch of men, and so a lot of sort of the most, even within the pantheon, the most powerful deities would be female. And there's this idea that it was a female that taught the Yellow Emperor how to, unite China. So there's always this sort of drive. And then there's the idea, even if you go back to sort of Origins mythology, there is this idea that Origins myth is not male, it's female. It's the mother goddess. The idea of who created humans wasn't a male god, it was a female. And so it's this weird tension, right, where you have this sort of cultural understanding that women spearhead religion and women sort of have a stronger connection to the unseen realm, but then at the same time you have that patriarchy. And I think it is that tension between spiritual attunement, people who do sort of feel the female energy that is sort of just beyond religion or mysticism, it's sort of just innate in the energies around us, the occult side, versus the political systems that are sort of stuck on top of the spiritual, you know what I'm saying? And so you have that weird, almost like, yin and yang tension, where you have the, politics versus what people feel. And I think that's what ends up happening. And yeah, it is feminism over there does look very different from here.
It's interesting about whether then there is a tension then between the intuitive and then like the agenda. So there becomes like these constructs of control that sort of come in over the top of what spirituality was always meant to be. And I think that's possibly worldwide that happens, that you can say that happens across culture, that there was a essence of what spirituality is, and then there's kind of the unfortunate elements of control that come in and kind of start strangling spirituality for the most part, which I think is why a lot of people turn to paganism, because they don't want the control, the dogma that has come through over a number of years and has arisen and promotes things that put certain people above other certain people. And that's true with, like a racist argument, it's true with a sexist argument, it's true with a homophobic argument. And you get all of these kind of like, we're going to tier people based on what we've decided and how we're going to control people within society. And I think that kind of takes away from spirituality and maybe even culture within spirituality, because then you start cherry picking, even with your own spirituality, what elements of your spiritual path and the evolution of that are perhaps more sanitized, perhaps more agreeable to your current palette without honoring where things have been, and also realizing the separation. So this happens within Celtic tradition, that people in modern spiritual practice are like, you can't be a warrior. Mm-hmm. You just can't. And there are some people who hold to the kind of reconstructionist form of, if you can't be a warrior because you're not being a warrior unless you're in the military service.
But that's such a narrow-minded view of, you're saying war is a literal war, and I think being a warrior has its figurative and it's just as important and compelling implications as well. And I think being a warrior means taking a stand. It means fighting for, it's always the just battle, the just war, always fighting the just war and taking a stand and vocalizing when you see injustice rather than being one of the wallflowers. And so I think people who, like what you were saying, if you say that to be a warrior is to literally hold and go out, I think that's such a narrow-minded view of warrior,
And in a lot of places, what warrior actually means is it has a connotation to protect. It's protect. It's not go and fight people for the sake. It's protection. It's like protecting your family, protecting your honor, protecting your country. Whatever it is, it's a level of protection. So I mean, if you're out there fighting the good fight on all kinds of levels to protect other people, that to me just feeds into the archetype of the warrior. There isn't a separation as far as I'm concerned. But people get very kind of bogged into these, we need to be limited ideas. And it's like, I don't think that's what we need. I think we need much more of a reverence and a respect when we're looking at all these things, and maybe calm down a little bit. And this comes into kind of the cultural appropriation argument, where people are arguing about like hairstyles and things. I'm like, I'm not sure that's the part that matters. We think we need to be fighting against the racism and the really problematic sides of things, and not focusing on the things that perhaps don't really affect anybody, like who's allowed to wear earrings and things.
In the Eastern traditions, when you're talking about the warrior archetype, there's like a code. You see, there's a similar honor code in the Japanese tradition. I think it's called Bushido. I don't know.
Bushido.
But okay, and then in the Chinese tradition as well, there's the code that all warriors have, the way of the warrior. Like at no point do they actually mention literal fighting, which is interesting, right? The way of the warrior has to do with compassion and who you take on. You can never, you never fight somebody smaller or weaker than you. You only fight somebody bigger and larger than you. And there's this idea of honor, the idea of who you protect, and sacrifice, self-sacrifice. And so I don't understand when people say to be a warrior means you have to literally use your muscles or something like that. I think that's kind of a soldier maybe, but a warrior is a very different sort of feeling behind that word. And you do have to have all of these other honor codes behind being a warrior. So
I think the presentation of different places of Eastern tradition, where how they look at war and warfare and the archetype of a warrior is again more intellectualized. I think there is much more of a code, like you said, and that you have like the art of war, you have the Bushido, you have these sort of tenets in place that people have kind of honored for a very long time. So it's kind of, again, it's the preservation of culture through a very narrow way of looking at culture. But the idea of what a warrior is very much preserved from the Eastern tradition through things like like that, where they have presented, this is what a warrior is, this is the way of succeeding, this is ways of victory, but they're always with a sense of honor, there's always with a sense of morality attached to it, which is really interesting. Whereas I'm struggling to think of any Western sort of equivalent at all. I'm not sure that there is one. And
I think there is like the jus bellum. Maybe I'm saying it wrong. Like the concept of the just war. Like, and then it's not real. Like, but like you know, like you hinted at, it's not sort of, you know, prevalent throughout history, throughout the culture. But there is at least that idea that you shouldn't engage, you shouldn't declare war unless there's just cause. But you're right, it's not really at the forefront of people's mindsets the way it is in the East. You know, so there is a peer pressure. If you are a warrior or you self-identify as a warrior and you don't follow certain honor codes, you would get that title stripped away, sort of from a peer pressure standpoint. You might not necessarily see the same equivalent in the West. This is, I think, what we're trying to get at.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting. It's interesting in that, again, it brings in that intellectualism, which is interesting for me. As I said, there's much more of a philosophical element across the East. It's kind of what I'm beginning to feel like, that there's much more of that consideration of philosophy and ideas, and that's not completely true. There is a philosophy in the West, although it tends to be like a much more ancient practice. Like you get like your Socrates and that kind of analysis and philosophy when you're considering that, and then you get into Jung and things. So I guess there's kind of like a jump. There's a jump in the West of kind of the way philosophy was, and then kind of like the way philosophy became in more modern times. Whereas I think in the East you kind of get the preservation of that kind of intellectualism and kind of defining these elements of the self, which ties into spirituality in the way that psychology does, because spirituality basically shows us who we are, as does psychology, in a different ways, but kind of it feeds into each other really well, I think.
Although Asia is changing for the world, like unfortunately, you know, you do see sort of the stripping away of that philosophy and the spirituality in modern China is a great example of that. Where, you know, in Hong Kong and even in part the developed parts of Taiwan, it is being stripped away. And so I think it's just following globalization. There is sort of this massive movement, unfortunately, away from that. But now it's coming back, I think, you know. But for a while there, it was sort of veering toward, you know, a more modernistic view and sort of denying the philosophical, you know, implications underneath the, you know, the progress. So.
And we're kind of talking about tradition and then progress within this. So I guess that's something we should talk about, which is interesting, is whether or not like tradition is standing in the way of progress, like some people think it is, and some people kind of imply it is, or if there is the possibility that we are looking at progress wrong, that to integrate and to carry forward the traditions of people, our forefathers, our ancestors, to honor the way that they interacted, is not to lose an important connection with the spirits of the land in particular. I feel that that's something that we've lost sight of in a lot of traditions, and it's not just one side or the other. I think there is a waning away from appreciating the planet as being alive and sentient, and the many spirits that work through the planet with us, versus kind of like a very clinical and very cold version of what progress is, and like focusing on technology and things more so than that organic relationship. And I wonder whether or not, because a lot of people, when they hear the word tradition, they go yuck, and I can understand that perspective, because when a lot of people who are interacting on a traditional level don't want any change whatsoever, and that's not possible. That's not the way humanity works. So, like, change is inevitable for all of us, whether we like it or not. And I wonder what the balance would be for that kind of, for like a spiritual goal. What would the balance be to preserve that matters from the past and integrating that into where we're going with it?
I actually have an interesting story to that. So my mom this summer was in Taiwan, and for various reasons, long-winded story, but she had to move my grandfather's bones, her father's bones.
Hmm.
So the culture is that it can only be a man because he was a patriarch, right?
Okay.
So only a male descendant of my mom's line can touch my grandfather's bones, and they had to like literally pick up his bones and move it someplace else. And my mom, and there was no more male descendants left. They're all dead, you know. So my mom's the only one left, and she's like, "Oh shit, what do I do?" So it has to be the next generation. But then the next generation, there's no men left. There's only her, and so she kind of had this conundrum, right? Like the two traditions, like conflict.
Hmm.
So her solution was to get my father to, move the bones. So she made my dad, who's, if you think about it, lineage-wise, is outside of her family, right? He
Hmm.
married in. So he was like, all right. So he moved the bones. This gets into a suspect ghost story, okay?
Hmm.
So then after he moved the bones, he got appendicitis and he had to get hospitalized. And my mom was like, oh my God, I did the wrong thing. And so she like prayed to my grandfather, like, summoned him, blah, 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 and then she's like, oh, okay. The grandfather actually just wanted her to move the bones because that was more important than the family line in that situation was more important than the male versus female. And my
Hmm.
father was outside the family. So according to my mom and her little, personal gnosis, she was like, okay, she apologized to my grandfather. He said that's fine, and he healed my dad, so his appendicitis went away. But that's the whole other story. But like I think that story sort of illustrates that tension between progress and the gender dynamics versus tradition, which is only a man can do it. But then when
Hmm.
it's only a man, how do you reconcile that? And so I think it has to be a case by case basis if you really want to be accurate, right? You can't
Hmm.
just have this blanket rule that goes across versus tradition
Hmm.
versus evolution. I think it has to be, you have to look at every specific case and analyze that for the factors and then make a decision. Oh, in this case, we should preserve tradition. In this case, let's evolve because of this, and that reason.
Mm. Absolutely. It's fascinating, isn't it? The kind of the way that blanket thinking is a problem. And blanket thinking is a problem for when we're talking about culture in general, and then kind of like spirituality in general. Like the blanket statements are the problem, I think, for a lot of us, that you can't do this or you can't be that if this, that, and the other. And I think that that is creating a problem for a lot of people. And it comes into the kind of the personal interactions with energies and situations like the one you describe, and then it comes into a problem when you're dealing with things on a much more mass basis. So when we're putting out information basically on the internet where anybody can effectively find it and interact with it, it doesn't always take into account all the personal factors that come into play with that. And I think maybe that's where some of the problems arise, that people are coming and they're not realizing that you can look at a tradition, you can look at a spirituality, and it's not going to look the same to you as it is to anybody else, because you're looking through the lens of your own personal experience, which is flavored by culture and experiences and gender and everything. And I think if we kind of honor that, we can kind of find a middle ground between
Yeah.
tradition and then personal evolution.
I think socially and politically, the only blanket statement we can make is that we need to find some way, some system that makes space for the diversity of voices. And we have to be able to sort of have a political system and a social system in place that genuinely honors the
Mm,
diversity of opinions. I think that's what the problem is. We don't really have that kind of a system. There's this idea of either you're right or I'm right, and then the other person by default has to be wrong. We can't both be right and we can't both be wrong. There's that, there's that
mm,
fundamental assumption that either one of us has to be right. And then there, if you know that, what ends up happening, it becomes a zero-sum game. So we're pushing people into thinking life is a zero-sum game. So
mm,
then we have no choice in this system but to like conflict against each other and battle each other because you want to be right and I want to be right, right? And
mm,
so I think that's fundamentally the problem. So the blanket generalization we can only make is that we have to have a system where you and I understand very genuinely that we can both be right and coexist harmoniously, even though we have fundamentally different views on religion and politics.
mm.
So
Absolutely. So that's a really nice place to kind of wrap up because we're approaching the 45-minute mark and Zoom will probably start yelling and flashing red lights at me any minute now. So thank you very much to Miss Benebell for coming on. Is
Thank
there
you for having
anything
me.
that you would like to promote that you're doing that you've got coming out or that where people can find you and that sort of thing before we just wrap up?
I have a YouTube channel, and well, right now I'm selling the Metaphysician's Day Planner, which is basically an example of how I use a day planner to integrate my metaphysical practice into my everyday practice. And so it has sort of the ephemeris tables for astrology, it has reference tables, so it's kind of like a grimoire-esque thing, but I don't like to use the word grimoire because it's not, it's a day
Mm-hmm.
planner. But it has all the reference tables in the day planner, so it's always at your fingertips. And not only knowing what your schedule is on Wednesday, but it's also knowing where the moon will be, where Mercury will be, where Venus and Jupiter will be, so that you can kind of plan your day, sort of observing both metaphysical and physical factors. And so
Mm-hmm.
if
Feeling
that's
those
something that
vibrations.
interests,
Yeah,
yeah, if something that interests you, take a look.
that's awesome. I know it's doing very well and is very well thought of by everybody who's gained a copy thus far. So if you haven't already, check it out. I will make sure that I will put Benebell's links below the video. So if you're not sure where to find her, it will be down there for everybody later. So thank you again to Miss Benebell for joining me
Thank
and
you,
for talking
Joey.
about cultural spirituality. It's one of those topics which is a little bit, we could probably talk for hours and hours and hours about it because there's so much about it. But if there's anything that you guys want to ask me or Benebell, you can just pop questions down below or you can come talk to us about it, I'm sure. So that's going to be it for today. So thank you very much and we'll see you next time. Many blessings.